Hey guys, it's Chris. What I'm looking at today is this Orico hard drive enclosure. It's a 2-bay hard drive enclosure that has the capability, so it says, of doing RAID 0 or RAID 1. I'm going to be using this personally as a backup system to my storage server, which uses a RAID 6. My storage server has about 10 terabytes of space in RAID 6, and it has surpassed the capabilities of my backup hardware of backing up to. Previously, I would back up data to 1 terabyte hard drives using Rosewell hard drive enclosures, which hold a single drive. But I want to simplify that and be able to back up my data to a single hard drive enclosure that has similar capacity to the data I already have. So I have a 10 terabyte hard drive RAID, but I'm not using much of it at all. I expanded that RAID to 10 terabytes in the anticipation that eventually I would use the space, but right now there's only about 3 terabytes used. Because of that, I'm going to be putting this together. I'm putting in 2 Western Digital Black 5 terabyte hard drives, and I'm going to be doing it in RAID 1. And this system is going to be plugged in only to perform periodic backups of the data on my storage server, and then this is going to be de-energized the rest of the time. This is supposed to be my cold backup. So some other things that I want to investigate are, I want to make sure that if I put these drives in RAID 1, that when I separate a single drive from the enclosure, I can still read data from it. I don't like it when hard drive enclosures put RAIDs together in a funky way, such that you need this specific hard drive enclosure to be able to view your own data. That seems like a bad precedent to have to rely on a specific enclosure for your hard drive information to be read. I want to be able to read this as a standalone drive or as part of the RAID. The standalone drive would only be used if the RAID were to fail or the enclosure were to fail and I needed to access the data. Just for fun, I also got a different hard drive enclosure. Well, it's not really an enclosure. This is a WEme or a WEme hard drive enclosure. It's a 2-bay enclosure that's really, you just vertically mount hard drives into it that, quick removal, quick installation. And the purpose of this one is you can do offline cloning. So with this plugged in but not plugged into a computer, you can put a source drive in one of the bays and you should be able to clone the data to a different drive without needing a computer in the way. And I think that's a neat capability, and I'm going to try it to see if it works. But this is more just for playing around with. This Orico enclosure is for the purposes of being the backup to my RAID 6 on my storage server. Okay, here it is. Anything of note? Well, that's aluminum shell, or yeah, it feels like aluminum. Aluminum front plate. Feels pretty solid. 2 hard drives look like they have a locking feature for the doors, although it's just a hex key, like an Allen wrench would be able to turn it. Once again, it's just to make sure you don't accidentally eject your drives. Then there's a power light, a RAID 0 light, a RAID 1 light, a normal light, a big light, I don't know what the big light is, and then a set button. And then on the back, there's a power switch, the USB 3.0 port, the DC power port, and then a series of dip switches, and those dip switches, I guess, are what control whether you're in RAID 1, RAID 0, just a bunch of disks, whichever one you want to choose. I'll have to read what the heck a big setup is. I would assume that's just a bunch of disks. But then I would guess that's what normal is, but I don't know. It doesn't matter, I'm not going to use them. I'm going to be using RAID 1. It looks like it's got a rear fan as well. Always good to know, although you worry how loud it's going to be. So, yeah, that's the enclosure. Dimensions of this thing, in case anyone's interested, it's pretty compact. This is the 9258 series, or 9528 series. This is the 9528 series, which is 195 millimeters by 145 millimeters by 122 millimeters. So it's relatively compact. Probably a little bit more than twice as high as a single hard drive enclosure, like the Rosewool ones that I use. But I like the way it looks, so it's fine. Set up RAID, here we go. Okay, so the big button means all drives in the RAID enclosure are grouped as one. Normal is individual disks. And then we have RAID 0 and RAID 1, and I'm going to be doing RAID 1. All data, yep, okay. Lock drives in the RAID HDD slots do not eject. I love the English in this. Do not eject a drive of a RAID is recommended. Replace the failure or error drive with similar or larger drive. Will get the RAID and files self-recovered. All files may lost once any drive failed or error. We're actually going to lock these in so they don't go anywhere. Don't want to screw things up before I even start. So now I'm turning them to the down position and they can't open. That's good. I'm going to do it on RAID 1 and see if that works. Now I'm on RAID 1. I'm going to press and hold the set button. And I'm going to power this on with this USB cable. Turn on my PC. Control panel, administrative tools, computer management, disk management. Let's see what shows up. You must initialize the disk. It shows one unknown disk with 4,657 gigabytes. So it shows up as a single drive. Based on that, I would say you don't need to use the Orico software at all. This is just going to, everything this displays to the computer is going to show a single drive. So, yeah, so it says Orico 9528X8, so any of their models allows to set up the RAID via the control switch or via the RAID manager. Okay guys, this is my server PC. I have the Orico enclosure plugged into it with the formatted RAID 1, showing as RAID 1. I'm going to set it up here, copy some files to it, and then pull one of the drives out, plug it in separately and see if all the files show up correctly. Then I'll put it back in. I'm probably going to reformat again, and then I'm going to use a program called fbackup, which is what I use for doing periodic backups, and I'm going to back up everything to this, which, based on my math, the fastest it could possibly back everything up is going to take a long time. So this is one of the 5 terabyte drives. I've pulled it back out of the Orico enclosure, and I'm going to be plugging it into my other enclosure that I bought, the WEme or the WEme enclosure, to see if the single hard drive, which I just copied data to, will display the data as an individual drive in addition to as the RAID 1 drive as part of the Orico enclosure, to make sure the Orico enclosure isn't doing anything funny. I'm going to unbox this WEme or WEme enclosure. If anyone knows how to actually pronounce it, let me know, so I can stop sounding like an idiot. Well, I'll sound like an idiot anyway, but you know what I mean. So here's the WEme enclosure. This is how it arrives. It's just got a plastic shield on it, but that's it. And it looks like, what's it got on it? It's got a power light and a light, then 4 lights, each showing 25, 50, 75, and 100%, I guess if you're cloning a drive, and then a B drive slot, so an A and a B, and then there is a clone button on top. And on the back is just USB 3.0, DC, and an on and off switch. And that's it. Okay, so it shows up as RAID 1 backup, the same label I applied to the RAID with the Orico device. So I think all the Orico device is doing is basically copying data to both of the drives identically. It's not a very complicated RAID device. And then, yeah, it looks like the files are all here, so. Yep. So I guess what that says is it's what I expected, it's good. It means the RAID enclosure will work, but if it fails, if the enclosure itself fails, or if one drive fails and I don't want to use the enclosure, I can pull the drive out and separately energize the drive and still get the information, which is what I'm looking for. So that's a success. Now, that seems like it's transferring greater than 100 megabytes per second, so all good there. I wouldn't worry about the transfer speed of this. Now, I wonder what the transfer speed would be for an SSD, but don't have an SSD handy to test. Or do I? Let me think about that. So, I was able to find an SSD that I'm going to try in this WEme enclosure, just to see if I can get a faster transfer rate. And this is going to be, I'm going to do a transfer directly from this hard drive to the NVMe drive in this computer, so it should maximize the throughput capability of the device. So we're going to try this out. Of course, getting this thing to line up correctly is a little bit harder with a 2.5-inch disc, but there it goes. I'd have to say, because of the way this is lined up, the 2.5-inch Samsung 840 EVO is not tightly secured in there. It's loose around the outside, so I'd be careful with the use of SSDs, thin profile SSDs in this thing. It looks like the opening for the SSD is made for the larger SSDs, like the Intel 730s. I'll copy a file from the hard drive to the SSD just on this WEme enclosure. Then I'm going to copy that to my desktop. So let's see how quickly this goes. So right now I'm transferring an 18 or 19 gigabyte file from the 5 terabyte drive to the SSD just within the WEme enclosure. And it says it's transferring at about 140 megabytes per second, which is pretty good. Better than gigabit speed, but not much. I mean, that's probably the fastest speed that the 5 terabyte drive can spin at. And now it's actually dropped, well, it's oscillating. It's like 125, 120 megabytes per second. That's still not bad. And then once this is done, I'm going to move the file from the SSD to this computer's NVMe drive and see how quickly that goes. It should go a lot faster. Okay, so now it's copied over to the SSD, and I'm going to move the file from the SSD to my desktop and see how quickly this goes. It is copying currently at 329 megabytes a second. It's down to 288, 285, 299, 295. Yeah, so transferring from a USB connected SSD to an NVMe PCIe drive, yeah, this is going at 270 megabytes, 275 megabytes a second on average, maybe. Every so often it peaks up to 300. So I guess with the offline duplicate function, you would insert the hard drives into the A and B slots. A is the hard drive to be cloned, and B is the target hard drive, so B would require a hard drive that's equal to or greater in capacity than A, and whatever's on B would be erased. You press the clone button for about 3 seconds, and when you release, the LED indicator will light up, and it'll start cloning, and then the indicator lights at 25 through 100% will flash in turn while cloning. Okay, so we're going to try the offline clone functionality. For the moment, I have a source drive in here that I'm going to populate with a few gigabytes of data. Then I'm going to put the receiving drive in and disconnect the USB cable and see how this works. So this is how my drives look right now. The source drive is formatted and has data copying to it. The receiving drive is unallocated space, and I want to see if I can do a drive copy in this fashion or if I need to have the second drive also initialized and formatted. Okay, with all lights on solid, the user manual says the cloning is complete. Now, for how long it took, about 25 minutes maybe, I would assume that the cloning process literally copies bit for bit everything on one drive to another. It's not intelligently checking what's already on the drives, it's just copying everything from one to the other. So, with that, I'm going to plug this back into the PC and see what's on each drive. So let's take a look. Okay, so it's seeing the single drive that I already made. It's not seeing any other drive. Yep, so that's the reason why both drives don't show up, because the second one is literally an exact copy, so it's offline because it has a signature collision because they're identical. So there you go, the clone seems to have worked. So it's good to know. Okay, so now that I've tested the functionality of the WEme Enclosure, I'm going to go back to the Orico Enclosure and use the same test drives that I just did for this offline clone, and I'm going to reformat them and try them again with the Orico Enclosure to try out the different functionality of that. So here we go. So I did see a good question that I figured I should try and answer. What happens when one of the drives fails? And I'm not really sure if it makes a noise or what's going on, so what I'm going to do is unlock these, pull the drives out that are in there, and I have two replacement drives I'm going to format and put in there. So this is a really old one. Well, this is 22 March 2009 manufacture date. What's this one? This is a 4 February 2010 manufacture date. So they're both pretty old. I don't know how well they'll work at all, but that's why I'm using them in part. That's interesting to me. So maybe this is an aspect of the drives themselves, but I can only see crystal disk info for one of the drives inside the Orico Enclosure. That's strange. Huh. Let's try this enclosure and see how it works. Okay, smart info looks good for both drives. The WEme Enclosure can do smart data for both of them. They're both showing up with the with the WEme Enclosure on. Now what I need to do is put both of these drives in the Orico Enclosure, format them as RAID 1, and then dump one of the drives and see what happens. Okay, so this is interesting to me. When one drive is in the Orico Enclosure in either port, smart data can't be read. But when I have two drives in normal mode in the Orico enclosure, the drive on the bottom has smart data that can be read. I have no idea why that's the case. I'm going to shut it down, swap the drives, and see which one shows up. Maybe this is the drives themselves that's the problem, but I think it's the G drive right now, which is on the bottom, I believe. Yeah, G drive on the bottom is the one who has smart data that's being read. Let's try this. Nope, it's the Orico enclosure. If there are two drives in there in normal mode, the bottom drive's smart data can be read, but not the other one. But if there's a single drive in either bay, the smart data can't be read. I don't understand why that's happening. But when I was in RAID 1, I couldn't read the smart data in either drive of the 5 terabytes. So that's a little bit confusing. Yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on there. Okay, so there's a 150 gigabyte RAID 1 in here. I have a 1.7 gigabyte file saved on the drives, and now I'm going to intentionally eject one of the drives and see what happens. So there you go. I guess this is what happens when you lose a drive in a RAID 1. Now, what happens when you put one back in? Well, comes back saying RAID 1, and nothing else happens. I don't know. So I'm not sure what I can glean from that. When you eject a drive, it definitely warns you that there's a problem. So we're going to try this again. I'm going to make a RAID 0, eject a drive, reinsert, and see if all the data comes back. So we're going to try that. I should have a 300 gigabyte single drive. Yep, shows up 279 gigabytes, RAID 0 Orico. I'm going to copy a file, once again, 1.7 gigabyte file. It's going to get copied here. Wow, that transferred fast. Holy crap. Is that right? Okay, so now I have a file in there. Now I'm going to do the same thing as before and see what happens. Okay, so I lost my RAID 0. Alarm's going off. I don't know if this is what'll happen if you physically lose a drive because it goes bad, but okay, put the drive back in. And it comes back. That's actually pretty interesting. And the file's still there. And the file runs no problem. Okay, so I don't know what else I can do other than test that, but it will alarm if you eject a drive. I assume it would alarm if you lost a drive as well, because it goes bad or whatever. The smart data thing is kind of confusing to me. Let me see if smart data shows up in a RAID 0. Probably won't, but nope. So smart data in a RAID 1 won't show up, in a RAID 0 it won't show up, and with a single drive in either port of the Orico it won't show up. But with two drives in there in normal mode, the bottom bay gets smart data, not the top bay. The WEme enclosure, either bay will show smart data. So that's interesting about the Orico, but now you can see what a RAID 0 looks like, a RAID 1. I'm not going to try the big mode. Honestly, I'm not sure who would use just a bunch of disks as opposed to two separate drives, or or RAID 0 or RAID 1 with this enclosure. but at least you can see what happens when a drive gets ejected, and it does alarm continuously from what it sounded like. So the more you know. Now I'm going to set this back to RAID 1 and reinsert my old 5 terabyte drives, which I had already backed up data to, and I'm going to see if the data comes back. So that's another test we can do here. Comes back in RAID 1. So it shows 2.68 terabytes taken up, which is what I backed up to it, so good to know. So it looks like the data I had in these drives came back in RAID 1 and everything's fine, despite my test using 2 other drives, so that's good to know. Okay, so I've reviewed this WEme and Orico enclosure to the extent I could. I'll give you my conclusions for the moment, but I do have some reservations, especially about the Orico enclosure, and I'll get to those at the end. So the WEme enclosure seems to do everything it's purported to do. It works really well. The clone function works. My biggest negative for it is that for slim 2.5-inch drives, they aren't really secure in there, and you risk breaking connectors. But otherwise, all the functionality seems to be there. Cloning works. It can read multiple drives simultaneously. Smart data is viewable. All that. So good. The Orico enclosure, it seems relatively easy to use. The RAID 0 and RAID 1 were able to be established. I didn't have too much trouble doing that. Normal mode shows both drives separately. The smart data problem I was having, I'm not really sure how to cope with that without using Orico's proprietary software. I'm reading online that if you do use their software, it should be able to view smart data for any number of drives in the Orico enclosures. That's with my 2-bay enclosure up to their 5-bay enclosure. So I think that's more a problem that I have with not wanting to have all this extraneous software. I always hate, a year down the line having this enclosure and then, having formatted or changed to a different PC and now I don't have the software anymore. And I'd prefer to just be able to use the enclosure without having to install something just to make it function. So if I need to install the software just to view the smart data, is it worth it? I don't know. I have to think about that more. My reservations on the Orico enclosure are more so because I read a lot of other reviews. It's not that I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm just reviewing stuff that I buy. I really don't have much experience in doing it. I just see if it works for what I need it for. And I'm reading more and more reviews of this. There's a lot of, out of 5 stars, you see a lot of 3-star reviews of this enclosure. And I saw a very negative couple of reviews for these ranges of enclosures. The worst review, I'll post a link down below, but it explains that for a 5-bay enclosure that there are some serious problems with the underlying hardware. It's obvious when this person disassembled their 5-bay enclosure that the hardware that's being used in these is not, the best. This is a budget type of enclosure, but they ran into significant problems with actually getting data dropped, data corruption, I guess, and they concluded that they cannot recommend a 5-bay enclosure to anyone. So I don't know how much that translates to my 2-bay enclosure, since the 5-bay apparently can do a RAID 5. So for the short term, it seems to be working for me. But the more reviews I'm reading, maybe it won't work in the long term, and I'm not sure. So if I figure out something new, or if the enclosure does something unexpected, I'll send an update video. But for the moment, both enclosures, for me anyways, seem to be working as intended. So I guess that's the end of this video. It probably went too long already. Hopefully I can come up with new stuff to make videos for in the future. See you guys later.